Hello, everyone, and welcome to the September 2024 Integration Down Under. Let's go through the slides real quick. So we have our organizers, Martin Abbott in Perth, Dan in Brisbane, Mick in Sydney, Wagner in Auckland, and myself here in Melbourne. And then tonight's talk is Dan Toomey talking about the new business rules engine. Dan and I have both been big veterans of BizTalk and the business rules engine. I think probably almost every BizTalk solution we probably built over time had some bit of the business rules engine in it. A lot of times it wasn't what it was designed for, but it was handy for a lot of different things that we wanted to do in both the pipelines and in our orchestrations. So let's go. Let me hand over to Dan and let's add his slides to the show and welcome Dan.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I assume you can see my slides now?
Yep, I can see your slides now.
Okay, fantastic. Yep, so as Bill already mentioned, I'm going to be talking tonight about the new rules engine capability in Logic Apps. And this is kind of another move by Microsoft to try to help people migrate off of BizTalk Server. So over the past several years, they've been trying to close all the gaps between the server-based BizTalk product and your sort of modern cloud architecture for integration. And the rules engine was one of those gaps that had to be filled. So now they've done their best to try to achieve that step in the hopes that more people will kind of move to a modern cloud architecture. So a little bit about me, a lot of boring details there. I'm an Azure MVP. I have written a couple of Pluralsight courses. I do have a blog, although I haven't really blogged a whole lot in the last year. I need to do something to rectify that. And I'm a consultant for Deloitte. And my official title at Deloitte tends to change every year as they do a reorganization and HR decides to change the title. So I think this month's title is Senior Engineering Lead or something like that. But I just call myself a Senior Integration Specialist because that's pretty much what I do. So on to the topic for tonight and about rules. So some people like rules, some people hate rules. But the truth is, if you're working with a business, any kind of business really, you're going to have to deal with rules because the rules basically encapsulate the decision logic and the policies for how that business operates. So therefore, every business has some kind of rules that govern how it works. And if you're going to be a developer and developing any kind of software solution, including integration solutions, then you're going to need to understand what those rules are and know how you're going to implement your code so that you can support them in the organization. Now, sometimes those rules are really, really simple. For example, if it's a retail business, you might have policies or rules for how you apply discounts. You know, somebody who is over a certain age, they get a discount, or if they buy heaps of stuff in one transaction, then they get a discount. And if you're a developer, you might look at that and think, oh, that's really easy to do. That's just 1 or 2 lines of code for me. And you'd be right. But then invariably what will happen is that, you know, after you implement that solution, the manager will come in next week and say, you know what, these old geezers, especially guys like that Dan Toomey, they're bleeding us dry. And we can't afford that senior citizens discount anymore. So we need to drop it down from 10% to 5%. And if you were clever when you develop your code, you'll congratulate yourself on having made that a configuration item so that you don't have to actually rebuild all of your code and retest everything. But then a week after, your boss comes in again and he says, we're not doing so well in this particular product line. So we're going to, for the next 2 weeks, we're going to want a promotion where we have a 20% discount, but only on this product line. And now you're not feeling so clever because you didn't build temporal boundaries or build your code to isolate certain product lines. So this just represents a reality of working is that things change, businesses change, and your code and everything that you build, your applications around it have to be able to adapt to it. Also, those rules sometimes are not so simple. Like, for example, If you've ever filled out a loan application and thought about all the things that you have to provide, all of those little details, all which need to be evaluated to determine whether you're a risk to deliver that loan, you can imagine trying to code all of that. And we had to do that for one of our bank clients. They wanted to automate the loan application process to try to automate as much as possible before that application had to appear before a real person for approval. It's quite complex. And the same thing with maybe calculating insurance premiums too, if you've ever had to go through that and all the questions that you have to answer. So the question is, if you have to implement all of that in code, which you can, it's a monster to maintain. It's a monster to test. And it also is not necessarily very versatile, because at any time that those rules change, you then got to work out how you're going to deal with that monster. So the answer in things like that is, of course, a business rules management system, or a BRMS. Now, there's many different kinds of BRMS products out there, and they all have different features, but they essentially follow the same basic architecture. You've got a data store to store your rules. You've got to have a method for authoring and testing those rules. You have to have the ability to provide the facts that those rules work on. And there's two kinds of facts, by the way. There's long-term and short-term facts. We'll talk more about that later. You've got to have an engine, or maybe several engines, depending on how you group your rules, to be able to process those rules, and some kind of decision services that then use that rules engine in order to evaluate the rules and come up with results. And then, of course, all of that makes up your BRMS, which is then consumable by whatever applications or services that require the use of those rules. So it's probably best to just kind of walk through a very simple example so we can understand how this works. So here's a very, very simple rule, right? If the shopping cart contains more than $1,000 worth of items, then you need to give the customer a discount. So if you're going to implement this rule in a BRMS, okay, you have to have some way to compose the rules. So there would be a rules composer, right? That's your authoring mechanism. And with that composer, you're going to create something called a rule set. And that rule set is nothing more than a collection of rules that logically belong together. So this is an example of one rule, but there might be several rules. Like you might have a rule about, the shopping cart. You might have another rule about the customer's age or a zip code or whatever it is, that they're all related to achieve the same thing, which is the final criteria of what discount is given to that customer. Now, each of those rules has basically three aspects to it. You have the facts that the rule works on, which is simply the data that you provide into the rules. So in this example, short as it is, we actually have three facts to work on. We've got the total value in the shopping cart, and then we've got the $1,000, which is the threshold for the discount, and then the actual discount amount itself, or percentage in this case. Now, I mentioned before about long-term and short-term facts. So the shopping cart in this case is a short-term fact. And it's short-term because that's going to vary with each instance, each call, right? Every customer and every shopping cart is going to have a different value. Whereas the other two, the threshold for applying the discount and the actual discount amount, are not so volatile, right? They're probably more like configuration items in there. So they're considered long-term facts. Then you have your conditions. So the conditions is what the rule evaluates to determine whether or not the rule needs to fire. And that condition always has to result in a true or false value. It's always a Boolean statement, and there could be a collection of conditions. So that overall combined, you wind up with an overall Boolean value. So in this case, if the shopping cart contains more than $1,000 worth of items, that's the Boolean statement. That's either going to be true or false. And if it's true, then the actions that go along with that rule are then met, and therefore the action is initiated. In this case, we give the customer a discount if it's true. So what are the benefits of a BRMS? Well, versatility is one benefit, because the idea is that it's a lot easier to update your rules and your parameters in the rules engine than it is to actually go and recompile your code. That is one of the key benefits of the way business rules management systems work. Also, those rules, by having them collected in one place and governed in one place, you have reusability. So all your different services can use the same rules as they need to, which also gives you consistency across the organization. It's also transparent because most rules engines try to author or present those rules in user-friendly language so that you don't have to be a technical specialist. And this means that your BAs and stuff can look at it and actually have input and understand how the rules are working. A good BRMS will allow you to test those rules independently of your applications to make sure that the logic is working correctly. And it's always, because it's easily maintained and updated, you can stay current with whatever the situation is. So for example, when you get those 2-week promotion periods, you can make that change and then, not have to then worry about how you're going to have to deploy new code and then roll back that code afterwards. And given that a rules engine is optimized for doing just that, executing rules, the presumption is that it's going to do it better than you could do it in writing your own code, which, because you're effectively writing your own engine and it could potentially be flawed rather than having a tried and tested product that knows how to do that correctly. And it's also more maintainable. So where does a BRMS fit in a cloud platform? And this sometimes is a point of contention because when we look at a microservices environment, one of the premises of microservices is that they're supposed to be self-contained. Sometimes they contain their own data and their own logic. So you might say, well, why would we want to put that logic in one place? But and granted, it doesn't always apply in every situation, but in the case where you have a business that's run by a number of different rules and they may be complex rules, it makes sense to put them in one place and then have all of the other microservices consume that. It essentially becomes another microservice, or maybe more realistically, a collection of microservices that provides a functionality. So if you kind of looked at it, put the microscope on it, you'd have services probably for the rules engine, for the management of the rules engine, for providing the facts, and for making the decisions based on those rules. So it's a good idea to kind of understand the concept of forward chaining because this is a very, very common algorithm for rules engines and how they execute. It's worth walking through because understanding this means you're going to understand how the BRMS works. So forward chaining means that you're arriving at a decision or a goal based on the evaluation of facts. And those facts can be long-term or short-term. So there will be multiple rules and multiple decisions to be made that ultimately, as you go down the line and evaluate all of them, eventually you're going to get to your final decision or your final goal. There is something called backwards chaining, which, as you can imagine, works the other way around, where you start with your goal or your premise, and then you try to find the facts to meet it. But that's usually not very useful in a rules engine kind of scenario. So one of the things about this is that the facts, as they go through evaluations and decisions are made, sometimes those facts can change in the process. And when it does, that means you need to go back and reevaluate decisions that were previously made on the former value of that fact. So let's walk through that as an example. Here we have a retail example. We've got a business that offers their gold class customers a 5% discount. Okay, so that's a long-term rule, right? Because that's a consistent threshold that they have. And you have John, who's a customer who comes in. Now, he doesn't have gold status. So when we're trying to determine whether or not he gets a discount, we evaluate those two facts, and we arrive at the decision that he doesn't get a discount because he's not gold, right? But that's not the end of the rules. There's other rules too. And one of those rules is that if you're over 65 years old, then you automatically get a gold status, right? You're a gold customer. Now, in this case, John is 70 years old. So when we evaluate that rule, we realize that his status is gold. Now, what's interesting here is that we've just changed the fact that the first rule was evaluated on. So we need to actually go back and reevaluate that rule. And in this case, now John is gold, and therefore he now gets a 5% discount. And the outcome of evaluating all of these rules is that John is a gold customer and he gets a discount. So yay, John. Okay, I'm just going to stop it and ask Bill if there's any questions at this point.
Dan, at the moment, there isn't any questions, but I will
Okay.
keep monitoring and let you know if there's any that come in.
Great. Okay, so now that we've kind of covered the basics and the fundamentals of a rules engine, the question now is, how do you implement a BRMS in Azure? So until recently, of all the products and everything that we had in Azure, we didn't have a dedicated BRMS feature in Azure. I mean, you could always try and build your own with all those tools, but there was none that was actually a service that provided it. And as I mentioned before, this was one of those gaps that you had between BizTalk Server and implementing Azure-based integration solutions. But as of June, early June, Microsoft announced the Azure Logic Apps rules engine. Now, you're probably, if you're on this call, you're probably familiar already with Logic Apps and what they do. They're basically workflows that can execute, and they can connect to either your cloud workloads or your on-premise systems. In fact, they have like well over 1,000 connectors right now. That's one of the really cool things about them. They can execute, long-running processes and in a very, very resilient way. And what we've now done, or Microsoft has done, is added a rules inference engine to that Logic App by using a combination of some new artifacts in Logic Apps and the capabilities of Azure Functions. And that rule inference engine has the features. It has the ability to compose rules. It has the ability to evaluate facts, evaluate conditions, perform actions. You can even prioritize those rules. That's something, by the way, I should have mentioned when I was talking about forward chaining. You could see from that example that I went through that it is possible, if your rules are not very carefully written, that you could get into an endless loop kind of situation with where a fact keeps changing and it keeps triggering a rule. So prioritization is a way to help you organize and optimize a rule so that they operate in the correct order. And they also, the rules inference engine includes the ability to define vocabularies. So vocabularies are really nothing more than a way to have semantic statements that will replace, more technical language. It just makes it a little bit more friendly, user-friendly to read. So how did they do this? Well, there's two sides to it. There's the authoring and the testing of rules, and that's answered by a standalone executable that's now available for you to create rule sets and vocabularies and fact providers. Now, if you've ever worked with BizTalk before, you're probably thinking, gee, that looks very familiar. And you would be right. It was actually very much the same business rule composer that's bundled with BizTalk Server. There are a few differences in how it works, but it's essentially the same interface and the same process for defining your rules. Then we have the Logic Apps bundled with functions. And what we have there is an example of, if you've worked with Logic Apps workspace templates before, you know that there's a Logic App with custom code workspace template. If you haven't seen it before, don't worry, I'll be demoing it in a moment. They've now enhanced that to include one specifically for rules engine. So closer look at this rules composer. If you haven't seen it before in BizTalk, it's basically a standalone executable that you can run to create rule sets, to create vocabularies, and to define your fact sources. And another really cool feature is the fact that you can use this to test your rules when you're authoring them as well. And I don't know if you've ever done this in BizTalk, but you basically can test your rule sets and you get this trace output that tells you what's happened. And it can be a bit daunting to try to understand what that is, but don't worry, I'm going to walk through that as well very shortly. So that's the authoring side. On the execution side, we basically have a new Logic App project template called Logic App with Rules Engine project. And it's basically the same thing as a Logic App with custom code, where you have a Logic App and a function, but the function now has built into it some decision logic with some dedicated rules engine libraries, and also some sample code to show you how to create that rules engine and use it. There's also a new artifact in the Logic App. Before we had schemas and maps. Now you've got an artifact type called rules. And that rules artifact is actually nothing more than an export of what you create using the rules composer that we just looked at before. Okay, so if we look at kind of go back to that example we had before where we were defining, that example rule and how it was implemented, your rule set is now basically implemented and executed in a logic app. And you have your conditions and actions and your facts that are provided. The facts, by the way, that are supported in this solution are either XML or .NET classes. That's one difference between the BizTalk version of the Rules Engine Composer. They supported both of those things in BizTalk, but also database-based fact as well. You don't have that yet, at least not in this preview feature. Now, in terms of testing the Rules Engine Composer, it's probably worth going through this as well. When you get this trace output, you have basically 4 different types of activities. So the first is the fact activity, which basically represents changes to a fact in the engine's working memory. So that's either asserting a fact, which is essentially loading it in memory, or updating the fact, changes value, which usually is going to trigger a reevaluation. And then retracting the facts when the rules engine is finished executing that instance, so that they're not used for the next one. So we can see examples of here in the trace output. I'm sorry if that's a little bit small to read. I hope you can read it. The first one is an assertion. The last one is the retraction after the rule set has been executed. Then, of course, you have your condition evaluation, which, as we mentioned before, is always a statement that equates to true or false. And we can see that condition evaluation test here is testing to get the ID and see if the ID is greater than 0. The left operand value is of 100. That comes from the fact, the instance fact. And the right operand value is the threshold, which is 0. And the test result in that case is true. So that condition evaluates to true. Now, because it evaluated the true, that means that rule is going to be triggered. So then what you have is an agenda update. So the agenda basically is the lineup of all the rules that need to be executed, whose actions need to be executed. And we can see that because that condition evaluation test was true, we have an agenda update to execute that rule. And then we have the actual rule fired event, which happens. And that means that whatever action is associated with that rule is executed. So that's how testing works in the Business Rules Composer. So with that, I'll just check one more time if there's any questions about this. But other than that, I'll just jump into the demo and show you.
No questions at the moment.
Okay, fantastic. Let me now change. I think probably the best thing I have to do is stop this presentation. Okay. Okay. Now, what I'm hoping that you can see is the Business Rules Composer in your screen. Is that coming through?
Yes, you got that, and then you got VS Code in the background.
In the background, which is exactly how I want it. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So this is the standalone composer. Okay. And we can go through and look at the different items in it. So first, I'm going to start with the Facts Explorer. So these are the facts that are supplied to the rules. And you can see that we have the option to do XML schemas. This particular rule set that I have loaded, it's a sample one that comes with the composer. Has a schema that defines a user. So you have some user details and you have their status, whether or not they're gold and what their discount is. There's also the support for .NET facts as well. And this one also uses some .NET based facts in the way of a Contoso purchase. And all that really is a .NET class that has a few properties in it that can be set. And then these are inputs into executing the rules. The actual rules are in this sample rule set, and you'll notice that you have a version. So every rule set can have multiple versions. This is version 1, and there's 5 different rules that are part of this rule set. So the first one is whether or not the customer is gold. Now, the condition always has to evaluate to true or false. So this particular schema node, if I go back to that, gold, you see it's actually a Boolean value in the schema. So it's enough to just leave that there as it is. It's because that's going to evaluate to either true or false. And if it's true, then the action here is to add 5% to the user's current discount rate, whatever that is, whatever that might be. The next rule is over 65. Again, this uses the schema, it uses the XML schema option, and it checks the user's age, and it evaluates whether or not it's greater than 65. And if it is, then it basically means that gold has to be true. And notice that there's an update status here. So that means that we need to update that node to make sure that the value of that is true. And then we have a couple of other rules as well. Now this rule actually uses the .NET base facts. So you've got the contoso purchase class and a property called get purchase amount, and we're evaluating whether or not that's greater than 1,000. And if it is, then the action is that we add 10% to whatever the current discount rate is for that. And then there's another couple of rules about checking the user's zip code. And if you're in a preferred zip code, but sorry, in this case, you're not in a preferred zip code, you get a very high tax rate. But if you're in the preferred zip code, you get only a 10% tax rate on that. And I should mention also the vocabularies as well. So when we look at a rule like this, when we say the schema's age is greater than 65, so rather than representing that with code-based symbols, that that phrase actually comes from the predicates. Now these are bundled with the composer, but you can also develop your own vocabularies as well to go along with that. Now, really cool thing about this rule thing is that you can test it in the composer. So to do that, I right-click the version and I say test rule set. And what this needs to operate is I have to give it an instance. That's the first thing it would ask. Now I've already added the instance, so it's already here. But basically, I've defined an XML file that's going to provide the facts that these rules need to execute on, and that's actually what's showing right here behind the rule composer. And what I want you to notice is that in this particular instance that I'm going to feed it, John, he's 70 years old. He is not gold status at the moment, and he has no discount at the moment. When I feed this XML into the rule set, the rules are going to operate, and it's going to actually update the file that gets put into it. So when I execute this rule, we should hopefully see some data change here. What we're expecting to see is that because he's 70, his gold status should change to true, and he should get at least a 5% discount. So keep your eye on that part, and let me quick test. And we see that it actually has worked. So he's now gold and his discount is 5. Now, if we go through the output, you can see there's quite a bit of trace that's generated from executing some very simple rules here. We have first our fact activities, which is basically asserting the facts. It's asserting the schema, loading the schemas that has been used to provide the facts. You have your first condition evaluation, which is whether the age is over 65 or not. 70 is greater than 65, so the result of that is true. And because that's true, just skip this fact activity for a moment, we have an agenda update. And the agenda update is saying that, okay, that condition evaluated the true, so now we need to add that rule to the agenda to be executed, for the actions to be executed. Then we had another fact activity, and that was looking at the status, the current, whether the customer was gold or not. But that condition gets evaluated here, and the status is gold. In this case, if you remember, originally his status was false. So that condition evaluated false. And as a result, we didn't get an agenda update from that because that rule hasn't fired yet. What we did do is we fired the rule for the over 65. And when that happened, it then generated an update to the schema. So it's now updated the status. And because that's updated the status, we had to go back and reevaluate the condition for gold status. And this time it came out true, which meant that we got another agenda update, and it meant that that rule fires. And that basically gave him gold status. And then the last bit is just the fact retracting all of those facts that were used. I hope that kind of makes sense. It's a little bit quirky to get used to. That's the rules composer. So that's the authoring and testing capability. Now let's see how this actually, how you actually develop the code that actually uses that rule set. And oh, and what I should say too is that you basically this rule store basically works on an XML file. And the XML file is basically this entire rule set and the vocabulary and everything in it. And that XML file is what we are going to use in as a Logic App artifact. And by the way, the XML is exactly the same format as what you would export from a BizTalk rules engine, which you could always do. You could export that as XML. It's the same format. So you can see that you can basically migrate your existing BizTalk rules engine stuff into the cloud now. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to be a little bit daring here, and I'm going to open a new window, and I'm actually going to create this project from scratch, so you can see what the process is. So let me just like that a bit. Okay, so what we want to do is we go into our Azure area, and what I want to do is in the Logic Apps, I want to say create a new Logic App workspace, right? Yeah, it's a little bit slow. Okay, so it's going to ask me where am I going to put that? Okay, that's fine. I'll just choose a place for that. That's fine. Yeah, we'll put it in here. That's fine. Okay, we'll select that folder. We'll give it a workspace name. I'll just call it IDU demo. Okay, and select the project template. Now this is the interesting bit here. We had before a Logic App and Logic App with custom code. Now we've got this new preview one, Logic App with Rules Engine project. So I'm going to select that. I'm going to select a function name for it. I'm just going to call it BRE function. Oops, sorry about that. Can't get the caps lock off. Okay, BRE function. All right, and then a namespace. Let's do IDU for the namespace. Okay, and I could choose either a stateful or a stateless. I'll just do a stateful for right now, and we'll call it execute rules. Okay, it's the name of the Logic App, and we'll open in the current window. Okay, so that's going to go and create this workspace for me, and you're going to see that this looks very, very much like your Logic App code. Yes, I'll trust the authors. In that your Logic App solution and you have your functions solution as well. And in that function solution, you have a couple of things in it. You've got the BRE function, which basically is the whole engine using the Microsoft-based libraries. Sorry, hang on, what happened there? Understand what it's all doing. There's a number of parameters that get put into this function. You have a rule set name, so that will correspond to the rule set that you load in the Logic App. I'll show you that in a moment. The document type, put XML, and then the type it is, and then the actual input XML itself. And this particular example takes a couple of .NET-based facts as well. And those facts come from this particular fact provider, which is a Contoso purchase. And all it is just a .NET class with a few properties in it. That's really all it is. Okay, and then that function takes those inputs and it basically executes the steps and produces an output. And the output looks as an object like this. It's a rule execution result, which is a bit of JSON. It has two properties. One is an XML document that becomes embedded, and then the actual purchase amount is calculated for you through that rules engine. Now, the way the engine works is it always has to have XML input into it, and that's simply because of the way it worked in BizTalk. Everything in BizTalk worked on XML. So at the moment, you will have to provide at least some of your facts, or well, no, actually, if you provide XML, then you can't provide JSON facts, is what I'm saying. It's either XML or .NET class based facts that you need to provide, and the output of that rules engine will be XML or .NET properties. So let's look now at the Logic app. So in the Logic app, the first change that's different is that you have your maps and your schemas, and now you have rules. And this sample rule set is exactly the output from the business rules composer that we were looking at before. So you'd create it in the business rules composer, and then you simply import it here into your Logic apps. And we have a workflow. And before I can show you the workflow properly, I need to actually build the function. So I'm going to say a new terminal. We're going to do terminal in the functions space. Okay, and to do this, I just got to do first a restore. And I think I call it BRE function. Yep, CS project. That should be very quick. So this is getting all the NuGet stuff that it needs. And then we'll do a build on that. Which should also be very quick. There we go. Okay. And then that brings in a bunch of libraries into your Logic app as well. So if we go into custom, you can see that all the libraries get, the DLLs get added there. So now if we look at the actual workflow that is given to JSON, I can go open designer. There we go. And it's a very, very simple Logic app in the sample. So all we have is an HTTP trigger, and there isn't even actually any schema defined because it doesn't really take any input. It's just meant to be used here as a trigger because all of the parameters to the function are actually hard-coded into the example. So obviously this is not how you build your real project, but this is just put here to kind of show you how things work. So remember we had those 5 inputs. We had the sample rule set, which is the name of the rule set that corresponds to this artifact here that we have under our rules. We then have to talk about what kind of document is going in it. And that document is an XML schema type called schema user. And here's the actual instance of that example. So you can see it looks very much like the sample that I just showed you before in the business rules composer. And then we have a couple of extra inputs that come from a .NET class that are going to be used, which is basically your purchase amount and your zip code. And then it just uses that to call the function to execute the rules engine and output a response. Very, very simple. So if I now want to execute that, I can go into my debugger. I can attach to my Logic app, and I can go and start debugging. And we can hope that this is going to work. Now, I've actually, after I've shown you this, I've actually created an enhanced version of this that's a little bit nicer to that one. But the reason I'm taking through this is I wanted to start from scratch so you can see how to actually do this yourself, what the process is. And again, this is a step from Microsoft to try to help people migrate from BizTalk Server, because that sample rule set, that XML file, is something you can export straight out of your business rules from BizTalk and use it. So because you've already done the authoring in that regard. Okay, this should be almost ready to run pretty soon. Are there any questions, Bill, at this point?
No. It always takes longer to build when somebody's watching.
Okay. Azure Right and everything going as well. So it's basically, this template gives you a really good kickstart for being able to develop your own rules and your own logic. And then, okay, we should be almost ready here, I think. Okay, there we go. I think it is ready. So if I go back to my file system and I right-click workflow, and I can go to the overview page, and this should actually show me Yep, it gives me the callback URL. I could take that URL and I could call that from Postman. But because this particular Logic app doesn't require any specific input, the easiest way to do it is just to click Run Trigger. And when I do that, it will execute because all the parameters are hard-coded into the Logic app anyway. And that should execute, and we should get a run here. And we see it succeeded. So if I click into that, we can go into the debugger, and we can look at what happened here. We can see what our inputs were and what the outputs were. So if we look, I think it's easier to look at it here. Is it? Yeah. Okay, so the response. So we can see that for our output, we had that XML document as first property, and then the property for the actual purchase amount post-tax. It's kind of hard to read, but if you can look at it, basically the gold status has changed to true. He's got a 15% discount, and it's calculated what his amount, what the amount was from the original purchase amount. Okay, at this point, I'm actually going to, I'm going to stop this. I'm going to actually show you the better version of this that I built because it's a little bit friendlier. So close that and go into here. And what we have here is I've enhanced the, oh, it's a little bit small. I've enhanced the Logic app a bit so that it actually will take an input file that actually provides the parameters. This is the way you would properly build the solution, right? And then because its input is JSON, I have to change that to XML because the rules engine can only handle XML or .NET. It can't handle JSON, right? So I have a map that transforms it into XML. I then call the function using the parameters that I got from the input. And then when I get the output, I parse the JSON object because we want to turn that XML document string into something a little bit nicer. So we compose it to a nice little object like this and break it down to that. And that will be the output. And if I get this guy running, so go ahead and kick him off. Once that's up and running, oh, this is the project, yeah, okay. Hopefully that builds. I can then call it from Postman and show it to you there. So if anyone has any comments or questions, good time to ask.
Not at the moment.
Okay.
This might work really nicely with the XML-based Logic apps that they're working on.
Mm. Yes, for sure. I would think, it's in preview at the moment, but I think probably we can expect maybe in a later iteration, it might be a little less clunky to use. Like they might have a specific call rules kind of action instead of the function. Although it would do pretty much the same thing. All right, that should be up and running now. So so I've got this pre-configured to call that particular Logic app. Again, here's my input. Same thing with John is 70 years old. He lives in a preferred zip code. He doesn't have gold status right now, and he's purchasing $900 worth of stuff, which is less than the $1,000 threshold. So what we'd expect to see is that he gets his gold status and gets at least some discount, and probably a reasonable tax rate. So if I go ahead and submit that, hopefully that's what will come back. Just the first call is always the warm-up one. Okay, there we go. So we can see, yep, his gold status is true. He gets a 5% discount, which out of $900 is just $855. And he's got a 10% tax rate. If I mess around with this a little bit, like if I give him a different postcode, he's going to have a much higher tax rate now. Yep, 20% tax rate, pretty expensive. And if I change the amount of what he's buying to something bigger than that, he'll get an even bigger discount. So we're over 1,000 now. So his discount now is 15%. So 5% because he's gold status, and another 10% because he's buying more than $1,000 worth of stuff. So just a little bit of more friendly way to test it. It's the same basic logic. And I've uploaded this to GitHub, so I'll show you the link. We can get the link if you want to download this particular enhanced version of it or not. I think that's all I wanted to show in the demo, so I might go back to the slides now. Okay, so basically we saw in our demo, we saw how to compose rules, we saw how to test the rules, both in the composer and actually when you deploy them, and then how we incorporate those rules in the Logic app. So it is a public preview feature, so there are some limitations. I mentioned before it supports XML and .NET class-based facts. It does require Logic Apps standard. You can't do this in the consumption-based Logic Apps yet. And it requires VS Code with the Logic Apps and Functions extensions, of course, loaded. So you can't do this in Visual Studio yet. What you can do is import your rules from your BizTalk policies. So that's really cool. And I mentioned, I showed you how there were different versions of the rule sets. By default, if you have multiple versions, then it will execute the latest version of that rule set. But if you want to target an earlier version, you do have a way to do it. You just when you call your rule sets, you just give it a little bit more information. And that's a bit of an example there, how to do that. So if you want to get started, if you scan that QR code, it's going to take you to this Microsoft Learn page that basically talks all about how you can create rules. So all the details and the steps are there and how to do it. Your prerequisites, as I mentioned, Visual Studio Code with the Logic App Standard extension. And Harold Campos on the product team has been very kindly offered and told me to share his email address with anybody who has some feedback about this or wants a bit of support with it. And he's really, really very helpful, I can tell you that. Obviously, being previewed, he would probably like a bit of feedback so they can prioritize the features that they want to enable before it goes GA. The sample code that I was showing you, the enhanced sample, is available here in GitHub, so you're free to go ahead and download that if you want. It just puts together a little bit more fancier Logic app for you. And then there's some additional resources as well. So if you want to talk a little bit more about the theory behind what Microsoft has done, you can scan that QR code. And I'll post these slides somewhere and then share the link somewhere so that you can download them if you want.
Dan, there is a question. Can the BRE testing be done in GitHub Actions or the ADO pipeline?
That's a good question. Well, I would think that you could, but not through the Business Rules Composer. You would probably... That's a really good question, because how do you get the trace output? That's generated through the composer. I don't know if there's an API that generates that's publicly exposed anywhere. Obviously, you could write your own tests. You could write your own unit tests in code and evaluate the results that you get back. But as far as getting that actual trace output for the rules engine itself, I don't think there's an API available for it right now.
The question is the new testing, will the new testing stuff work with the business rules? It should, because it's just calling a function.
Yeah, that's all it is. Yeah.
The new testing stuff should be able to call a rule in the pipelines, because you can call anything that's got a function. So
makes sense to me.
Yeah. So John, it'll be it was John Brillis that asked the question. John,
hey, John.
Give it a try and give us the feedback.
Absolutely.
So I haven't had a chance to play with much of the testing stuff. I've been on a big project and haven't really had much time. Hopefully over the next couple of months, I'm going to do a little bit more on the testing of the standard, especially. So, but I mean, the way they're calling it with using the function and things like that, that should work just normally. I mean, it's basically they're loading up a library for the business rule and the function's calling it. So it shouldn't be any different than what we're doing when you're using the JSON tools or anything like that.
It's really just a logic app and a custom function, right? Custom code. It's
Yeah, and it custom code's calling the DLL that they've supplied.
That's right.
So same way that BizTalk used to call the rules engine. So anything else? Okay, I'll bring us back on the screen and let me switch over to my slides. So there was the one question from John, and basically thanks again, Dan, for presenting. It was really good. We had a couple of months gap in there, but we're going to get. I've already got a topic I think for next month, so that will be good. It does change a little bit next month because we go on daylight. Some of us go on daylight savings time as of the 6th of October. So it changes. It changes the Brisbane time and the I think Perth time. I don't think it changes anybody else because they go on daylight savings. John just said thanks, Dan, in the comments.
Thanks, John. Thanks, John.
Yep. So basically, thank you very much, Dan, and that is the end for tonight. Keep a watch on the Integration Down Under website for the October topic, and we will go from there. Thank you very much.
Cheers.